Hi, and welcome to Turning Point School of Art. I'm Professor Sarah Perks, and this is week 4, Future Cities, and this is all about science fiction. In my very first video of this summer school, I showed this picture by the artist Ming Wong. It's part of an ongoing piece of work. These images are from Ming's Windows on the World Part 2, that involves a collision of science fiction and Cantonese opera, putting the two together to think about how China as a nation deals with ideas of the future. He's also inspired by a classic Russian film from 1972 about space called Solaris by Andrei Tarkovsky. Ming then produces a live onstage science fiction Cantonese opera, working with a group of young actors, a piece called Looking at the Stars. There's so many examples of artists working with science fiction that I think it's fair to say contemporary art loves science fiction. But why is that? Let's take a closer look. If we take a long-term view, both science fiction and contemporary art are actually quite new. So contemporary art is what's being made now, but it's really very closely related to modern art, which started around the mid-19th century. And then science fiction, let's say that really starts to get going with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818. So they sort of grew up together, and they come of age in a time where there's a great belief in science and technology and progress, and the beginning of widespread use of electricity and the invention of all the things we take for granted today, like radio, telephone, TV. And there's a huge preoccupation with the future that becomes a new kind of mythology, an interest in time travel, meeting aliens, or going into space, for example. Both contemporary art and science fiction have lots of detractors, so people looking down on them. Basically, some say that both things are rubbish and not really high art, but that's just not true. Finally, both contemporary art and science fiction like to be self-referential. So they contain lots of references to previous works that came before. As we learned in our workshops, borrowing from previous art is part and parcel of the process. The horrific events of World War II made science fiction seem much less like fiction. And then Roswell, an alleged spaceship, crashed in 1947 in the desert of New Mexico, and this ignited the imaginations of a generation, and then future generations again. In America, science fiction films of the 1950s became all about the Red Scare, reflecting anxiety about the Cold War. The aliens were not really aliens, they were communists. Science fiction has been used in everything from political propaganda to inspiration in architecture. This art gallery is designed by Oscar Niemeyer, and it's one of my favorite galleries in the world, a big UFO on the coast of Niterói, not far from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Something to think about is whether science fiction is actually about the future at all, or whether it's a way of addressing difficult issues in the present, a lens to turn things around, to look at our current climate from a distance and imagine things that just seem impossible right now. Science fiction likes to emerge in certain moments around the world. For example, Bengali science fiction in the 1970s, Japanese anime of the 1980s, Chinese literary science fiction of the last decade, and so on. Here's an example of an exhibition dedicated to unexpected encounters between Latvian science fiction and contemporary art. And here is the Caribbean art scene staking a claim on science fiction. There's millions of examples of science fiction writers used in contemporary art, sometimes working alongside visual artists, but most often as inspiration. Ursula K. Le Guin is a big favourite. This exhibition was at the DCA Dundee in Scotland, and here the curators Owen O'Dara and Kim McAleese take Ursula's 1969 novel called The Left Hand of Darkness to champion, in their words, those who are crafting alternative spaces and worlds that hint at ways in which we might better live, love, and care for one another. London-based artists, the Otolith Group, presented a large international retrospective of their work under the title Xenogenesis, which is named after Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. Octavia Butler was an award-winning African-American female science fiction novelist. She often dealt with themes like climate change ahead of their time, and in 1998, she wrote a book about a dangerous, unpredictable president who caused chaos under a promise of making America great again. Butler was also known as the godmother or the grandmother of Afrofuturism, something that we've looked at briefly on this course. It's a concept that explores the African American and the African diaspora's experience through a blend of science fiction and historical imagery that reimagines Black futures. Here's a clip from a piece of work called The End of Eating Everything by artist Wageshi Mutu about human overconsumption, very much a science fiction inspired style of work, with a performance by singer Santi Gold. Wangeshi is well associated with both science fiction and Afrofuturism, with lots of her work inspired by science fiction. Creating collage that deals with female representation. They appear to be cyborgs, a fusion of woman and machine. There's lots of other futurism movements out there. Gulf futurism, Sino-futurism, climate futurism. And I think what they all have in common is a way of creating little wormholes that wriggle through to talk about how we might imagine a better world. Science fiction, together with contemporary art, can start to visualize and realize that process. It's only through that first act of imagination that something amazing can be created. Thank you.